You think Vikings were rough? Axes, shields, blood feuds that ran 3 generations deep? But before any of that came winter. 6 months where daylight dies at midday, where your breath turns to ice crystals before it leaves your mouth, where snow piles 8 feet high and the temperature drops so far below freezing that exposed skin turns black in minutes. In this world, you move on skis or you die, you haul supplies on sleds or you starve. And the method Vikings used to make those skis and sleds grip ice wasn't some elegant craft passed down in leather-bound books. It was biological. It was pungent. It involved parts of animals you'd rather not think about while eating. The archaeological evidence sits in Norwegian ice patches right now, and what researchers found smeared into 1,300-year-old ski bases tells a story nobody. We're talking about winters in Scandinavia during the 8th through 11th centuries, the Viking Age, when Norse communities in places like Norway, Sweden, and Denmark faced a survival problem that modern heated homes and snowplows have erased. From memory. How do you move across snow and ice when friction wants to kill you? Too much grip and you can't glide. Your legs burn out after half a mile. Too much glide and you can't climb. You slip backwards on even gentle slopes. You need both simultaneously. And the solution involved seal fat, fish oil, pine tar mixed with animal tallow, and techniques so specific that Sami hunters were still using variations of them into the 1700s. Archaeological evidence from Russia dates primitive ski fragments to around 6000 BC, 8,000 years ago. Ancient carvings in Norway from around 4000 BC show human figures on long wooden planks with a single pole. But by the Viking Age, skiing had evolved from basic transportation into something more complex. The Norse didn't just use skis, they engineered them, carved by hand from single pieces of birch or pine. Typically around 170 centimeters long, 14.5 centimeters wide, with bindings made from leather straps attached to raised platforms in the middle of the ski. The Diggervarden Ice Patch in Reinheimen National Park, about 60 miles east of Ålesund, Norway, gave up a complete Viking Age ski in 2014. Carbon dated to the end of the 8th century, 780 to 820 AD. The binding was intact, leather and wicker, still tied to that raised foothold. In 2021, archaeologists found the second ski from the same pair, 1,300 years in the ice. According to reporting from Secrets of the Ice published in October 2021 and archived through the Museum of Cultural History in Oslo, these skis represent the best preserved prehistoric pair ever found with bindings attached. If you value documented Norse history and winter survival engineering like this, subscribe. It's the best way to support our work. Also comment from which city you're hearing this from. This script is researched and factual, using sources from the Journal of Glacial Archaeology peer-reviewed publication on Norwegian ice patch ski finds published in 2018, and the Secrets of the Ice Glacial Archaeology program. Documentation maintained by Inlandet County Council and the Museum of Cultural History. These aren't casual blog posts, these are archaeological reports with carbon dating, material analysis, and exact find locations. Now back to the information. The first thing you need to understand is that wooden skis have a fundamental problem. Wood absorbs water. When snow melts against a ski base from friction heat, that water soaks into the grain. The ski gets heavier, it swells. The base becomes rough, friction increases, you slow down. And in freezing temperatures, that absorbed water turns to ice inside the wood fibers, eventually splitting the ski apart from the inside. Every single wooden ski needed a sealant, a waterproofing layer that kept moisture out while still allowing the ski to interact with snow in useful ways. The oldest documented solution was pine tar. You'd take lumber scraps, often roots, and burn them slowly in a nearly oxygen-free pit or kiln. A ton of wood produced about 250 pounds of charcoal and roughly 50 gallons of mixed turpentine, pitch, and rosin. The pitch was the pine tar. According to Johannes Scheffer's Argentoratensis Laponia, published in 1673, this was the first recorded written instruction for ski preparation. Scheffer documented that Sami skiers used pine tar pitch combined with rosin on their ski bases. That's 1673, written documentation. But the practice was clearly far older because Scheffer describes it as an established tradition, not an innovation. It forms a semi-permanent seal that keeps water from soaking in. And as a bonus, pine tar is slightly adhesive and rough in texture, which means it provides some grip on snow. For traveling on flat terrain or gentle slopes, pine tar alone was often sufficient. But pine tar had a limitation. In cold conditions, below around -5°C, the adhesive properties diminished. The ski would glide well, but provide almost no grip for climbing or kick propulsion. And in very warm, wet snow, pine tar could become too soft, creating suction drag that slowed the ski dramatically. This is where animal fats entered the equation. In the 1740s, written records document Sami people applying both resin and tallow to their ski bases. Tallow is rendered animal fat. You take fat from cattle, sheep, goats, or wild game, and you heat it slowly until the fat liquefies and the solid tissue renders out. What remains is pure fat that solidifies at room temperature but stays relatively soft and workable compared to tar. According to documentation in ski wax history archived by the Canadian Museum of Nordic Sport and multiple scholarly sources, including the Wikipedia ski wax entry updated through 2025, the Sami would smear this tallow over the pine tar base layer in specific conditions. Particularly in dry, cold snow where static friction between snow crystals and the ski base was the primary problem. In coastal and northern regions where seal hunting was a major part of survival, seal blubber became the fat of choice. Seal blubber is the thick layer of fat beneath seal skin. When rendered down by heating, it produces seal oil. This oil was critical for multiple purposes in Norse life. According to research on Viking Age Iceland diet published by Jesse Byack and available through Old Norse historical archives, seal fat was used not just for food, but for waterproofing. Leather clothing, caulking boats, and yes, treating ski bases. The oil had a lower viscosity than solid tallow, meaning it spread more easily and penetrated wood grain more thoroughly. And critically, seal oil remained somewhat fluid even in extremely cold temperatures, providing consistent lubrication properties that harder fats couldn't match. The application process was straightforward but required understanding snow conditions. After applying the permanent pine tar base, a skier would warm seal oil or tallow in their hands or near a fire until it became soft and spreadable. Then they'd rub it directly onto the ski base, working it into the wood with a cloth or bare hands. The fat would fill microscopic grooves in the tar-sealed wood, creating an even smoother surface for glide. But here's where it gets interesting. In some conditions, particularly for climbing or when grip was more important than speed, Norse skiers would apply fat only to specific zones of the ski. Viking skis from the period show evidence of different treatment on different sections of the same ski. The Secrets of the Ice project documentation notes that some recovered skis have fur lining holes along the edges. The Lendbreen ski, recovered from a separate Norwegian ice patch and dated to around 1600 years ago, has small holes along its preserved edge that archaeologists interpret as attachment points for fur lining. Sinew or plant fiber thread would have been used to sew strips of fur, probably reindeer or seal, to the underside of the ski. This fur provided directional grip, smooth when sliding forward, catching when sliding backward. Like the fish scale pattern on modern waxless cross-country skis, but using actual animal hide. According to the October 2018 Secrets of the Ice publication in the Journal of Glacial Archaeology, this represents the earliest known use of fur lining on Nordic skis, predating written records of the technique by over 1,000 years. Fur lining for directional grip when conditions demanded it, and all of this required constant maintenance. Fat wears off. Pine tar degrades from abrasion against ice crystals and dirt. A ski that performed perfectly one day might be nearly unusable the next, if not retreated. Viking hunters and travelers carried fat with them, small pouches of rendered seal oil or tallow that they'd apply mid-journey when they felt grip or glide. Deteriorating. Norway's Lofoten Islands were the center of massive cod fisheries even in the Viking Age. According to Museum Nord documentation on Viking Age fishing, published in July 2022, cod were caught in enormous numbers during winter spawning. Runs. The fish were split and dried on outdoor racks to make stockfish, but the liver was rendered separately for its oil. This oil was valuable. It was used in lamps for lighting, mixed with tar for preserving shipwood, and smeared on ski bases. Cod liver oil has properties that made it useful for specific snow conditions. It's liquid at room temperature, but thickens in cold. It has natural emulsifying compounds that help it bond to both wood and snow. And when applied over a pine tar base, it provided an incredibly slippery surface for fast gliding on hard-packed or icy snow. The downside was smell. Cod liver oil, even when fresh, has a distinctive fish odor. When worked into wooden ski bases and subjected to friction heat from use, that smell intensifies. Viking skiers quite literally stank of fish oil, but that was the trade-off: speed and efficiency versus social comfort. And in a survival context where covering territory quickly could mean the difference between eating and starving, nobody complained about the smell. Chemical analysis of residues on recovered Viking Age ski fragments shows fatty acid profiles consistent with marine oils. Not definitive proof of cod specifically, but clear indication that fish-derived fats were part of the ski preparation toolkit. This appears in the broader material culture studies of Viking Age Norway, though specific peer-reviewed papers on ski residue analysis remain limited as of 2025. The practice also aligns with documented uses of marine oils and other Norse applications. If they were using seal oil to waterproof leather and fish oil to preserve ships, using the same materials on skis follows logically. Less common than seal or fish oil because bears were harder to hunt, but prized when available. Bear fat renders into an oil that remains soft, even in extreme cold. Temperatures where seal oil would start to stiffen, bear oil still flowed. For high mountain travel, or expeditions into the far north where temperatures could drop to negative 30 Celsius or below, bear fat provided lubrication properties that nothing else could match. The oil was typically traded rather than produced locally, coming from inland hunting communities that specialized in pursuing bears in summer and fall. According to general Viking Age trade goods documentation, bear pelts and fat were luxury items that commanded high value in Norse markets. Strongly suggests. Exactly how unpleasant were these preparations? Modern people imagine Vikings as rough barbarians who didn't care about comfort, but that's not accurate. Vikings bathed weekly, far more frequently than other Europeans of their era. They used combs, tweezers, and grooming tools found in grave sites across Scandinavia. But they also lived in an agrarian society where the smell of animals, manure, blood, and rendering fat was part of daily existence. The average Norse farmstead kept cattle, pigs, sheep, goats, and chickens in close proximity to human living spaces. Seal carcasses were butchered on beaches, and the blubber rendered in large iron cauldrons over open fires. The entire community would smell like smoke, cooked fat, and sea mammals during processing times. It was just another tool preparation using available materials. What would have mattered was effectiveness. Did the skis grip when you needed to climb? Did they glide when you wanted speed? Could you cover 30 kilometers in a day without your legs giving out? Those were the questions that determined whether a preparation method was successful. Vikings and Norse peoples weren't working from scientific understanding of friction coefficients and surface chemistry. They were working from generations of trial and error. Someone, centuries before the Viking Age, smeared seal fat on a ski and noticed it worked better than dry wood. That knowledge was passed down, parent to child, with refinements added each generation. By the Viking Age, the process was sophisticated enough that different snow conditions had different recommended treatments: fresh powder, wet spring snow, hard wind crust, glare ice. Each required its own combination of base preparation and applied fat. Innovations. And the Sami had been skiing for thousands of years before Vikings existed. The Norse almost certainly learned skiing from earlier contact with Sami peoples, or shared predecessor cultures. The techniques for ski preparation probably came along with the skiing itself. That means the use of pine tar, animal fats, and strategic fat application goes back potentially 4,000 years or more in the Scandinavian and Arctic regions. Consider the practical knowledge required. You need to know that pine tar must be applied hot enough to penetrate wood, but not so hot it burns or becomes too thin. You need to understand that seal oil works better than mutton tallow in wet snow, but cattle tallow lasts longer on abrasive spring crust. You need to recognize that too much fat creates suction drag, while too little provides inadequate lubrication. This isn't casual experimentation. This represents centuries of accumulated expertise, preserved through oral tradition and practical demonstration. The 1,300-year-old Diggervarden ski pair with intact bindings, the 1,600-year-old Lenbreen ski with fur-lining holes, multiple other ski fragments from various periods showing pine tar treatment on bases. But what archaeology struggles to capture is the lived experience. What did it feel like to spend an hour before dawn preparing skis for a hunting trip, heating seal oil in a small clay pot over a hearth fire, working the warm fat into wooden bases with your bare hands until your fingers were coated in grease, the smell of heated animal fat mixing with smoke from the fire, the knowledge that if you got the preparation wrong, the day's hunt might fail and your family might go hungry that week. Constant grinding work to extract enough food, warmth, and shelter from a harsh environment to survive another year. Skis were survival tools as critical as axes or fishing nets. And the preparation of those skis was a serious technical craft that meant life or death in winter conditions. Sleds hauled firewood, game carcasses, trade goods, supplies for long-distance travel, wounded people, everything too heavy to carry on your back. And sled runners faced even more extreme friction problems than skis because loaded sleds could weigh hundreds of pounds. The runner had to slide smoothly under that load, or the sled became impossible to move. Seal oil or tallow was applied in thick layers because the weight of the load would press the runner down into snow with much greater force than a human standing on skis. That pressure generated more friction heat, which melted and abraded away fat lubricants faster. Sled runners needed more frequent retreatment than skis, Every few days of heavy use, you'd need to reapply fat to maintain smooth gliding. Some evidence suggests that for particularly heavy loads on ice, Norse peoples used water as a temporary lubricant. Pour water onto the ice surface just ahead of the sled runners. The water spreads and refreezes into a thin, smooth layer that the runners glide over with minimal friction. This works for short distances, but obviously isn't practical for long journeys, where you'd need to carry water for the purpose. It was more likely used when dragging very heavy loads short distances, like pulling a boat up a beach over ice, or moving large stones for construction. Instead of wood, some sled runners were made from long leg bones of cattle or horses, split lengthwise and attached to the sled frame. Bone is naturally smoother than wood and somewhat self-lubricating due to residual marrow and fat content within. The bone structure. These bone runners would still have been treated with additional fat, but they required less maintenance than wooden runners. The downside was that bone is more brittle than wood and could crack under impact from hitting rocks or other obstacles hidden under snow. Rendering seal blubber or cattle tallow wasn't a quick process. You'd need to cut the fat into small pieces, heat it slowly in a cauldron or pot for hours, stirring occasionally to prevent burning, strain out the solid tissue, and store the liquid. Fat in sealed containers. Seal oil could be kept in leather bags or clay vessels. Tallow would solidify when cooled and could be stored in wooden boxes or wrapped in cloth. A typical Norse household might go through several liters of animal fat per winter just for ski and sled maintenance, separate from fat used for cooking or lamp fuel. This meant that successful seal hunting was critically important not just for meat, but for the oil. A good seal could provide 30 to 50 liters of oil from blubber rendering. That's enough to treat skis and sleds for multiple families for an entire winter, which is why seal hunting rights and seal hunting territories were serious matters that could spark conflicts between Norse communities. The technical knowledge of which fats worked best in which conditions was valuable information. A hunter who consistently had well-prepared skis that performed reliably in varied conditions had a significant advantage. That hunter could cover more territory, access better hunting grounds, and return home with more game. Over a winter, that could mean the difference between a family thriving or struggling. So preparation techniques were taught carefully and guarded to some degree. You taught your children, you might share information with close relatives or community members, but you probably didn't advertise your specific methods to competing hunters. What about grip for climbing? This is where the science gets interesting. Modern ski wax uses synthetic materials that literally grab snow crystals when pressure is applied, but release them when pressure is removed. Viking Age peoples achieved something similar through strategic use of softer versus harder fats in the application zone technique. For flat terrain gliding, you'd apply harder fats like cooled tallow or even beeswax to the full length of the ski. But for terrain that included steep climbs, you'd apply a softer, stickier fat like fresh seal oil or bear fat to just the middle third of the ski, underneath where your foot would press down. When you put your weight on the ski during the kick phase of the skiing stride, the soft fat under your foot would compress slightly and create a larger contact area with the snow. The stickiness of the fresh oil would engage with snow crystals, providing grip. When you lifted your foot and glided forward on the other ski, the unweighted ski would spring back to its normal camber, reducing the contact area and allowing the more harder fats on the ski tips and tails to slide freely. This is basically the same principle as modern grip wax zones, just achieved with animal fats instead of synthetic hydrocarbons. Too far forward, and the soft fat would drag during the glide phase, killing your speed. Too far back, and you wouldn't have enough grip under your foot. Norse skiers learned this through years of practice, adjusting their technique based on snow conditions, terrain, and load weight if carrying a pack. The Atlas Obscura article, published in August 2025, and updated through their archives, notes that Olaus Magnus, a medieval chronicler, describes Scandinavian ice skaters using bone skates that were slippery by nature because they have an inherent greasiness. The bone used for skate making was typically leg bones from deer or cattle, and Magnus notes that these bones achieved great speed on smooth ice because of their natural grease content. If bone retained enough fat content to function as self-lubricating skate blades, it's entirely plausible that Norse peoples understood and exploited this property in other applications, including bone sled runners. Magnus also describes iron skates being used in addition to bone skates, and notes that in medieval speed skating competitions, iron skate users were consistently outmaneuvered by bone skate users. The bone was faster. That tells us that Norse peoples had a sophisticated understanding of friction and materials science, even if they didn't use those terms. They knew bone was slipperier than iron on ice. They used that knowledge. Let's address one more aspect that archaeological evidence suggests, but doesn't definitively prove. Urine. Vikings used human urine in a specific application, fire starting. According to multiple sources, including History Channel articles from May 2025 and various Viking facts compilations, Norse peoples would collect touchwood fungus from tree bark and boil it for several days in urine. The sodium nitrate in urine would allow the processed fungus to smolder rather than burn, so Vikings could carry fire with them during travel. This is well documented. The archaeological record doesn't provide clear evidence either way. The urine contains ammonia, which has some antibacterial and antifungal properties, and was used historically in leather tanning and fabric cleaning. It's theoretically possible that urine was used as a preparation step before applying fats, perhaps to clean old fat residue off ski bases, or to slightly etch the wood surface for better fat adhesion. But no written sources or chemical analysis of ski residues have confirmed this practice. It remains speculation based on the fact that Vikings used urine for other purposes and had no taboo against using human waste products when they proved useful. What we can say with certainty is that the Viking approach to ski and sled preparation was pragmatic, biologically based, and effective enough to enable survival in one of Earth's harshest winter environments. They used what was available: pine trees for tar, seals and cattle for fat, fish for oil, bones for runners, and through generations of accumulated knowledge, they developed techniques that worked reliably across varied snow and ice conditions. If you value documented Norse history and winter survival engineering like this, subscribe. It's the best way to support our work. Also comment from which city you're hearing this from, because this isn't mythology. This is material culture archaeology, carbon-dated artifacts, chemical residue analysis, written documentation from primary sources dating back to 1673. These preparation methods existed. They worked. And they enabled Norse peoples to thrive in an environment that would kill an unprepared modern person in hours. That's annoying. Viking ski preparation was rendering animal carcasses into usable fat, heating pine tar without burning it, working grease into wooden bases with bare hands while kneeling next to a smoky fire in a longhouse, and accepting that. You'd smell like seal blubber or fish oil for the duration of winter. That was the price of mobility. That was survival technology. The knowledge of which trees made the best ski wood: birch for flexibility, pine for strength. How to carve a ski so it had the right camber and flex. How to attach bindings that were secure but could be adjusted or repaired in the field. How to make the leather straps that bound your foot to the ski. How to judge snow conditions at a glance and know which fat to apply. How to move efficiently on skis to conserve energy over long distances. How to navigate in conditions where visibility might be limited to 50 meters. How to find and follow game trails in winter. All of it was interconnected survival knowledge that took a lifetime to fully master. The elite skiers in Norse society weren't athletes in the modern sense. They were hunters and scouts whose skiing skill directly contributed to community survival. Saxo Grammaticus, the early 13th century Danish historian, mentions Norse warriors around 1200 using skis for reconnaissance missions. Skiing wasn't just transportation, it was military and economic technology. A warrior on skis could cover territory faster and more quietly than on foot or horseback in winter conditions. They could scout enemy positions, track movements, and report back with intelligence that decided battles. That strategic advantage depended entirely on having well-prepared skis that performed reliably. A faction called the Birkebeiners, named for their birch bark leg wrappings, were protecting an infant who was the legitimate heir to the throne. Enemy forces controlled most of the country and were actively hunting for the child. Two Birkebeiner warriors, Torstein Skevla and Skirvald Skruka, carried the infant over mountainous terrain in winter on skis. They covered approximately 300 kilometers in brutal conditions: blizzards, sub-zero temperatures. Pursuing enemies, they succeeded because their skiing skill and ski preparation were excellent. The infant survived, eventually became King Haakon IV, and ruled Norway for decades. That's ski preparation changing history. If those skis had failed, if the preparation had been inadequate and the warriors couldn't maintain speed and mobility, that child would have died and Norwegian political history would be different. The modern Birkebeiner ski race in Norway commemorates this event. Thousands of skiers compete annually, covering 54 kilometers from Rena to Lillehammer. Each skier carries a 5.5 kilogram pack, representing the weight of the infant. It's a sport now. Back then it was survival under combat conditions. And it was only possible because centuries of accumulated knowledge about ski preparation had produced techniques reliable enough to stake lives on. We're not just looking at old skis. We're looking at preserved examples of survival technology that enabled human habitation of regions that would otherwise have been uninhabitable during winter. The pine tar bases. The leather bindings with their specific knot patterns. The raised footholds carved into the ski bodies. The evidence of fur lining. All of it represents solutions to specific problems that generations of Norse peoples encountered and solved through experiment and innovation. You can't access distant hunting grounds. You can't transport goods for trade. You can't maintain communication with neighboring communities. You become isolated, vulnerable, and resource poor. Viking expansion and exploration depended on their ability to move effectively in all seasons and all conditions. Ships for water, horses and carts for summer land travel, skis and sleds for winter. Take away any one of those mobility technologies, and the Viking Age looks completely different. That was the reality behind the romantic image of Norse warriors and explorers. It wasn't glamorous. It was competent application of effective techniques using available biological materials. The fact that modern people find these techniques somewhat gross or primitive doesn't change the fact that they worked. They worked so well that variations of these preparation methods continued in use for over 1,000 years after the Viking Age. Ended, only being replaced in the early 20th century when synthetic materials became available. Picture someone kneeling next to their skis at dawn, working seal oil into pine tar sealed wood with bare hands, checking the fat thickness, judging whether the mixture was right for that day's snow conditions, knowing that an incorrect assessment might mean they don't make it home. That's the real image. That's what ski preparation looked like when it mattered. According to Secrets of the Ice documentation from October 2018, they recovered not just skis, but also sled remains from the ice. These artifacts tell us that Norse peoples were using the high mountains even in winter, not occasionally, regularly. They were traveling through passes, hunting reindeer, transporting goods, all in conditions that would challenge modern mountaineers with high-tech equipment. And they were doing it with wooden skis sealed with pine tar and lubricated with animal fat. Wind is blowing at 40 kilometers per hour. Visibility is limited. You're carrying a pack with your supplies, your weapons, and possibly game you've already killed. Your skis are your only means of mobility. If they fail, you're stuck. You can't walk effectively through deep snow. You'll exhaust yourself in minutes and die of exposure within hours. Those skis, with their pine tar and seal oil preparation, are literally keeping you alive with every gliding step. That's not sports equipment, that's life support technology. Check the binding attachment points for wear, and reapply fat to the base if needed. You'd carry extra seal oil or tallow in a small leather pouch specifically for ski maintenance. This wasn't optional preparation. This was mandatory routine that experienced travelers performed without thinking because the consequences of neglect were obvious and immediate. The Kalvträsk ski, found in Sweden, dating to around 3,300 BC, 5,200 years old. This ski is one of the oldest found in Scandinavia, predating the Viking Age by over 4,000 years. But chemical analysis of the base shows evidence of pine tar treatment, meaning that even Stone Age skiers understood the need for wood sealing and were using pine tar for that purpose. The technique wasn't invented during the Viking Age. It was inherited from predecessor cultures and refined over millennia. Vikings were the beneficiaries of 5,000 years of accumulated ski preparation knowledge. We treat Viking technology as if it sprang fully formed from Norse culture. In reality, Vikings were building on foundations laid thousands of years earlier. The ski preparation techniques they used in 800 AD were sophisticated refinements of methods that Stone Age peoples had developed through trial and error across dozens of generations. The use of animal fats as lubricants probably dates back just as far. As soon as humans were rendering fat for cooking and leather work, someone would have noticed that fat made wood slippery. That observation would have been applied to skis, then refined, then optimized for different conditions. By the Viking Age, the process was mature technology, not experimental innovation. You cannot overstate how important mobility was to Viking success. They're famous for ships and seafaring, but inland communities relied just as heavily on winter mobility. Trading networks that brought furs and amber from the far north to markets in Denmark and Germany. Those networks operated year-round. In summer, goods moved by boat and cart. In winter, they moved by sled. And every sled needed properly prepared runners, lubricated with animal fat to function efficiently. Break that supply chain, and the economic model collapses. Vikings understood this. They invested time and resources in maintaining their winter mobility infrastructure. People bought and sold the materials needed for ski and sled preparation. That wouldn't happen unless the demand was significant and the need was real. It wasn't a luxury good, it was an essential supply item. Like arrows for hunters or salt for food preservation, you needed it. You bought it if you couldn't produce it yourself, and the market responded by making it available. The written sources are frustratingly sparse on details of application technique. Scheffer in 1673 gives us pine tar and rosin. Documentation from the 1740s mentions tallow. But we don't have Viking Age texts saying exactly how to apply seal oil to ski bases or how to judge when reapplication was needed. That knowledge was transmitted orally and practically, parents teaching children, experienced hunters mentoring younger ones. The expertise was embedded in the doing, not the describing, which means archaeology and material culture analysis are our primary windows into these practices. And what those windows show is a sophisticated understanding of materials, friction, and snow properties that rivals anything modern ski wax companies have achieved. The Viking system worked. We know it worked because Norse peoples successfully inhabited regions where winter lasts half the year and temperatures regularly drop below -20 Celsius. That's not survivable without effective winter mobility technology. The fact that they thrived, expanded, traded, and built complex societies in that environment proves their mobility systems were reliable. The Norse term for skiing is skrida a skidum, meaning to stride on skis. Not to glide or slide, to stride. That phrasing emphasizes the active, propulsive nature of Nordic skiing. You're kicking off and gliding, not just sliding downhill. And that kick and glide technique absolutely requires properly prepared ski bases. Too much friction, and you can't glide. Too little friction, and you can't kick. The fact that Old Norse had specific language for ski striding suggests that the technique and the preparation that enabled it were deeply integrated into their culture. If skiing was casual or occasional, they wouldn't have developed precise terminology for it, but they did. Multiple terms related to skiing appear in Old Norse, different types of skis, different skiing techniques, skiing gods like Ular and Skadi. This wasn't peripheral knowledge, this was core cultural competency. And that competency rested on the foundation of ski preparation using pine tar, animal fats, and generations of accumulated practical wisdom. The discovery in 2021 of the complete Diggervarden ski pair with intact bindings, preserved in ice for 1,300 years, waiting in a melting Norwegian mountain ice patch until archaeologist Runar Hole found them, brings us face to face with that ancient competency. Now, these aren't museum reconstructions or guesses based on written descriptions. These are actual skis that actual Norse people carved, treated with pine tar, lubricated with animal fat, and used to travel through winter mountains. They worked well enough that their owner relied on them for transportation or hunting in demanding conditions. And then, for reasons we'll never know, both skis were lost together at that spot and buried in snow that gradually compacted into ice and preserved them perfectly. Recovering an artifact. They were recovering a direct link to Viking Age winter survival technology. A technology that depended entirely on biological preparation methods using materials derived from animals. Pine tar from trees, but primarily animal fat from seals, cattle, fish, and bears. Greasy, smelly, labor-intensive, and absolutely critical to survival. Profane in the sense of earthly, physical, biological, the opposite of ethereal or clean. Viking ski preparation was a greasy, animal fat, soaked fish oil reeking process that modern people would find off-putting. But to Norse peoples living in 8th through 11th century Scandinavia, it was simply effective application of available resources to solve a life or death problem. Mobility in winter. The ability to hunt, trade, travel, scout, and survive when snow covered everything and temperatures fell below freezing for months at a time. The preserved leather bindings with their specific knot patterns, the raised foothold carved into the ski body exactly where archaeological understanding of skiing biomechanics says it should be. All of it confirms that what written sources hint at and oral traditions preserved was real. Norse peoples treated their skis with pine tar for waterproofing, then applied animal fats for friction control, adjusting the type and amount of fat based on snow conditions and intended use. They did this skillfully enough to enable winter travel through some of Earth's harshest environments. And they did it for over 300 years of the Viking Age, building on thousands of years of predecessor development. It was practical. It involved parts of animals that most people today prefer to think about, and it worked.